You write about how the idea of development has changed over the last decades in India, and probably in other parts of the global south as well. Can you tell us a bit more about these changes and their consequences?
See, I can talk about India more confidently. I'm not sure about how it's changed in other parts of the global south. But there was a time till about the 90s when development basically meant provision of some basic necessities for ordinary people, for things like housing, drinking water, electricity, health facilities, and so on. So when you talked of development, that was what immediately came to mind. But from the 1990s onwards, after the neoliberal reform setting, by and large, development seems to have become obsessed with the abstract growth. So it is just in terms of pursuit of growth rate, 7%, 10% growth. And which basically means anything from setting up of shopping malls to luxury apartments to flyovers and expressways and so on. That fundamentally has transformed the idea of development in the sense that you're now looking at a sort of more first world within the third world for a globalized elite. I would say that's the basic change.
And yesterday you described the informal economy in India as molecular economy. Can you tell us what you mean by that, and also something about the state's reaction to that form of economy?
See, the state's reaction is very interesting. But first, let me just say that this, what I'm terming molecular economy, is actually a sort of shorthand for what we normally call the informal economy, but I don't want to call it informal, and I also want to include within it other kinds of everyday transactions which may be in fact not strictly speaking happening within the informal. So it is sometimes informal within the formal and things like that. Even things like agricultural land and people working on agricultural land. But more specifically with this urban informal sector, the government position is interesting. It is because at one level the government is, any government, whichever party comes to power, is more or less committed to eliminating this, to bringing it all under regulation, so in terms of paying taxes, in terms of paying their electricity consumption and paying wages and so on. But that actually the government also knows doesn't happen. It cannot happen because these economies are at some level of precariousness in terms of they're not really into the logic of accumulation and expansion. So what happens is that governments sometimes overlook, even knowing that this is not legal, but because the people involved in it are poor, the government has to overlook some of these illegalities, because at some level today the governments cannot deny the moral legitimacy of their claims to be in the city, for example. So Partha Chatterjee calls it political society because this is the arena in which he believes. There are all these negotiations take place with people forming associations, relating to political parties and so on. But more interestingly, after the current recession, some parts of within the government have also started rethinking about, and this has happened, as I said in my presentation also yesterday, even in the World Bank and IMF, senior economists have started rethinking this so-called underground economy as perhaps something which needs to be developed or protected in some fashion. How far it will work out in that way we don't know yet. But there is definitely an increasing recognition among people that this is a sector which needs to be uh, not eliminated, but perhaps expanded and upgraded and supported in some fashion.
Mhm. And the last question, you say that a new post-capitalist imagination is needed to overcome capitalism. Could you elaborate on that and tell us what it could look like for you?
See, by post-capitalist imagination, what I mean is not, of course, the old 20th century socialism or state socialism and so on. That, I think, is a false poser of the state versus market. That's based on that state versus market or state versus private entrepreneurship poser. And I think the mistake that socialists in the past have made is also to see all forms of commodification, commodity production, and so on as being capitalist. Whereas actually, historically, trade, entrepreneur, commodity production, entrepreneurship, all these have been there since antiquity. And there are different forms it takes, but nonetheless, even commodity production is not something specific to capitalism. By handing over everything to capitalism, we actually weaken our position. And I think, for example, when I talk of these molecular economies, these are crucial ways in which common people simultaneously preserve their autonomy. They don't have to work as somebody's employee, and at the same time, they manage to earn some living for themselves, a reasonable living sometimes. And as I said in my paper, these are not suboptimal economies as many economists seem to think, at least not all of them. There's a huge amount of wealth being created there. So, and the crucial question here is whether, if governments stop the continuous attacks in the name of urban reforms or in the name of urban renewal on, like, at the moment, I think this is part of the neoliberal scenario everywhere in the world, that people who are engaged in hawking, in pavement selling, in various other kinds of informal occupations are severely under government attack. So every time they manage to come up a little, build a little bit of their resources, the municipal corporation or the police will come and basically take it away, so that they're never able to actually build up anything over time. So one thing is definitely that this needs to change, and poorer people have the initiative and the entrepreneurship to do it. And I do not see this as antithetical to socialism of the kind that I imagine, or antithetical to a post-capitalist future. Let's not call it socialism, a post-capitalist future. I do not see this as an antithetical to that. In fact, the people who are most terrified of these kind of activities are the big capitalists in a sense, because they do not give them the approach to the entire market. But in a sense, this activity thrives on that segment of the population which can never enter the capitalist market, so to speak. But I also think that apart from all this, we need to think in terms of multiplicity of forms of ownership. So cooperative ownership, cooperative forms of property, small private ownership, and maybe even the corporate capitalists, once you bring them under public audit, where their technological choices are not determined solely by the board of managers, but also by the community which is going to be affected by the company being there, by its water and air being used up and its pollution. So all that, if all that is brought under, companies are brought under some kind of public audit, my sense is that they will cease to actually be the kind of monsters in the sense that they can't. This logic of endless accumulation only happens when they are unchecked. But that way, they will have to emerge different kinds of checks on their growth also. And one can very well see some form of that surviving into a post-capitalist future.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.